We're underway. Is there someone to call the meeting to order? Is that myself?
Actually, I
One,
think
two, three
that
members?
you're the chair, right? Didn't we do that last time?
Maybe.
And I was like, Fran, you're the chair.
Fran, you're the chair, you're on. All you do is call it to order.
Magic words. All right.
All right, we are in order. All right, so you have a few duties and tasks that we need to attend to that should be attended to on an annual basis that we've never done before, at least during my tenure. So the first and foremost is we want to obviously talk about comp and class, and that is probably your first task. If you've had a chance to look at the charter at all, beginning on page 24, it talks about what you and as a personnel board can and should do. And one of the things that it does ask you to do is standardize and classify all positions in the classified service of the city. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We've gone through and prepared what we have had in place versus what we're recommending be in place. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Neil. Eric Peterson, Assistant City Manager, Director of Finance and Administration. The city had retained McGrath Human Resources Consulting Group to prepare our compensation and classification study. This is an executive report available to the public. In that report, they do highlight some findings we will walk through. They are continuing with the city to work on job descriptions now to align and modify, update our job descriptions. Dr. Peoples, is there anything you want to say before I dive in on the report?
Probably not, that won't come up during discussion, other than, of course, thanks for being here. But it is a huge body of work, as the city attorney shared. There's not a time where we could remember doing this. I don't think it has been done. So it's really important work. And now aligning with our budget process is a really important time to do it. So thank you for being here, and happy to answer any questions as we move through it.
So McGrath presented this report to the city council, so they've received this information. Again, the purpose of this being here today is that if we're going to implement this, the personnel board per the charter has to look at the pay plan policy and also the classification of the grades and such. So I'm going to step away from this and just quickly show you our current salary range structure. This is available on the website. I'll zoom in so you can all see it a little better. As you can see what we currently do, and I'll just use labor as an example, custodians, a minimum annual salary, a maximum annual salary, a biweekly or pay period minimum and maximum across the range. Historically, those ranges were established, and then once in place, the city, when it would go through a 2% increase, a cost of living increase, would adjust those ranges in total. So all these different pay ranges, which I believe there are 43 for us. With about 150 folks in the workforce, that's a lot of different salary ranges that we're dealing with. Also, we do have the wonderful conundrum, as you all know, in HR, of sometimes we take that number times 26 and it doesn't quite equal that number, or you get the hourly rates and such. And not theoretically, but technically in finance, we are not to pay anything over a maximum or under a minimum. And so we end up with the rounding issues. Now it's a very minor issue, but again, for consistency purposes, we would like to get away from having those rounding issues present, especially if there's going to be labor issues around the amount of pay. So that is the current pay structure. Again, police, fire, fire obviously subject to collective bargaining at this time, police potentially, labor, inspector engineering, parks and recreation professionals, administrative support. And as you can see, some of the highlights here, you'll see different administrative assistant levels at different titles, even though doing much of the comparable similar work, which is one of the findings you'll see. And then your administrative section here is predominantly the unclassified service, which is not part of the charter for the personnel board to deal with, obviously, in the system of classification and the merit system.
And one of the things we do then is, of course, memorialize all this in what we call a pay ordinance. So ultimately, it goes back to council. Council looks at this, council approves it as an ordinance, and it becomes the law of the city of Webster Groves. We can't exceed it without changing the ordinance, amending the ordinance as we need to amend it. So it does put limits, spending limits on it, but it's a burdensome group at this point.
So the compensation and classification study, and please stop me at any time if you have questions.
I have a quick question,
Yes.
and we might get into this, but are the raises just annual raises based on tenure or is it
So,
performance?
Historically, the city has had two models of pay increases, which you'll see in 2.02 that we're asking for amendment. one in July that is a COLA, generally has been 2%. I'm not aware of any time in recent history it's been more or less than that. And then what has been called the 1.5% performance pay increase in January. 1.5 is an absolute average. Many people got below 1.5, some people got well over 1.5. And that was issued based on an evaluation system. I'll certainly let Dr. People speak to it, as I was not here for the last one, but looking back and having talked with some employees, it really was an expected raise that the evaluation system was meant to justify, rather than raises being justified by the evaluation, in my opinion, looking back at things. Well,
last year was my first budget year. I joined the city in January and quickly delivered a budget. It became pretty quickly evident to me that that pay for performance system was not put in place consistently across the organization. What I heard from directors and from employees was just some pretty poor practices in terms of how it was done. And so we sampled a smattering of those performance reviews, and they were all over the board. But what I can say with certainty is that about 90% of them did not have comments or a review. They just kind of check boxes. So I did not recommend that city council do the pay for performance last year, because I wanted to be able to implement an evaluation system and to get some consistency across the board to doing it. At that same time, or a little bit afterwards, is when we went with McGrath and Associates for the comp and class, and they came up with some similar findings as well. And so deeper conversation as we move towards this. I certainly have historically been in favor of pay for performance plans. We still are not at a place within the city where we have those evaluation processes in place.
Okay, so it's just a standard X% at this time. In the last
What
year.
we're going to recommend, last year what was recommended was the COLA.
Okay.
And that's what council went with. Excuse me, I did not recommend the COLA or the pay for performance. Council did move forward with the COLA.
Okay,
This year, all I will be recommending is that we put in those minimums based on today's conversation, what came out of the comp and class and a COLA.
perfect.
Okay, this is maybe a little bit of an aside, but
Sure.
so there's no pay for performance review system in place, but is there any kind of performance review system in place?
I'm gonna turn it over to our HR manager. And he could.
I'm currently in the process of looking at a new system. Like you said, our current system was where our supervisors were just evaluating an employee. The employee didn't really take it serious. They would just come in and sign it and just be like, okay, it's the same as last year, as long as I get something. So now we went through and did evaluations, and we kind of went through and reviewed how the supervisors were evaluating. So our next step is to teach these supervisors, have training on better ways of evaluating employees. So we're currently looking at training for them. And then we're also looking at a new digital form of evaluating that's standard across the organization. So training is going to be done with that. And with that, we're hoping that with those two new sets of training and technology, that we can get some consistency across the board. So
The job description, job description update might help though too with that. So you almost need that first, then that kind of.
The job descriptions are woefully outdated. Really
Yeah.
pleased with the process we're going through now, and not to belabor it, but we formed an employee evaluation committee comprised of employees from all of the departments, and they put forth suggestions on what the 2021 evaluation tool should look like, and we use that tool that those employees developed. It still needs some perfecting, but we are making some progress.
Thank you.
as we look at the comp and class report, I won't read through everything because that will keep us here all day, and you're all educated professionals in this. I do want to jump into our comparisons to give you a sense. We obviously did do data collection, looked at the market and comparables all around that all that is included in the report. On the minimum salary comparison, because this is really the evident nature of where we are at as an organization, 40% of our benchmark titles are below the market minimums. So we are underperforming our competitors and our peer local governments for a good chunk of our job titles. Most of those are going to be within public works, parks and rec, some of those administrative type of roles, lower job salaries, which you will see when we show you the comparison chart of where we would like to move. 60% are within the acceptable average of market minimum then, of course. So some at danger of falling out, which will need consistent updating, which goes back to our practices, as this report has showed out. Oftentimes our market comparables were 2-3 local cities, and that was good. This is our first ever deep dive into a compensation and classification study in recent history. So our market comparisons here are to midpoint salaries. Again, 40% would indicate salary ranges may not be in line. The comp ratio, 50% of the bench point are lower than the average income in the market. So as has been our trend here to pay slightly below market, we've compensated in other ways, but essentially we are now, especially in this day and age, facing that market pressure. And then our average market salary analysis, 32% of positions are below the average overall average market rate.
Is this looking at St. Louis or?
Correct. Yep. I can pull you up to our
Sorry.
comparables here. Let's see. Right
That's a
there.
great question.
There's our comparable organizations.
Okay.
So this is data selected from them all. Obviously, some of the fire districts are only relevant to the firefighter pay and such. But the point being is even McGrath had to do some open records because the local government community wasn't quite sure what to do with this. And
Okay.
so
Okay.
but-
Just as a quick aside, because the city has done their comp and class and it has really garnered a tremendous amount of conversation. Now the Post Dispatch has asked for sunshine requests from every municipality and every governmental entity to try and compare to the government comp and class, this St. Louis City comp and class that was done. So we're sort of riding that roller coaster a little bit, but again, it verifies our numbers.
Reason why the city wasn't used as a comparable local government here.
They wouldn't respond.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You would think we would share better.
Yeah, no.
So again, I won't belabor everything. Please, if there's a specific question, we can go through those. Maximum salary comparisons, 25% are within the acceptable difference of the average. For maximums, 34% are at or above market maximums. So that is our market data summary. Again, when you look at the current compensation system, 43 unique salary ranges for 59 different job classifications. And you can see the difference in grades is 0 to 12%. The spreads vary between 10 to 40%. So we have some very tight grades. We have some very large ranges and such. And there's really no grade. It's we sort of pick out where things should be and then it gets plopped in the system. And then there are internal equity issues that were brought up, both with gender and race also. Surprisingly, doing quite well in some areas in that regard. But I'll let you read through that. I think one of the bigger issues, and certainly Dr. Peoples noted this, is really a compression issue with these variety of ranges. We've got some positions, supervisory positions, right tight to other positions, such as fire captains and firefighters. What is the incentive to become a fire captain? Then ultimately, what's the incentive to become a battalion chief? You make more in overtime, staying in the lower range. So
With compression as well, I will just say we've got the pleasure of having employees with a lot of seniority. We have a lot of long-term employees. But those salaries, as you know, start compressing as you're hiring in new people. And so we've really struggled to manage that and have it offset. We also have quite a bit of turnover right now, as is all employers as part of the great resignation. That's been difficult, particularly within our trades. We are not able to compete at all with those salaries.
And we're having people to leave for $2, $3 because our current salaries for our labor positions just not at the minimum standard. So we'll hire someone and they'll get a job offer or talk to another municipality for $2, $3 more.
Per hour, not just one.
Per
Because we would give that to
$3 per
We
hour.
would do that.
And we're just not being competitive in those areas.
And with the COLA that we plan on recommending to council for budget, and those discussions are still kind of firming up this week, I'm not sure we'll be competitive even with that. It's just what our budgetary allowances we have the room for, but in looking at what CPI is and what our neighboring cities are offering in terms of COLA this year, we're not even going to keep pace with that.
And the COLAs and the increase at the end of the year, whenever you did the other one, right? Because there were two. Are
There
both,
were two, but we didn't do that last year.
Yeah,
So just
but both have to be included in the budget that you're doing
yes.
now. Okay.
which I'll explain a little bit about our potential theory that we're bringing in, and why we're asking for this change as we get into that space. Just briefly, years of service by age group, as you can see, we have a very large 65+ years of service and group. And then also you can see our average employee age there. So lots of tenured employees really giving us some longevity, but also again, a bubble coming and real recruitment concerns ahead. Our compensation philosophy was presented. There's obviously many different ways to look at compensation, but the council, without explicitly taking that vote, did center around the recommendation of trying to be at average on the market. So not being the leader in the market, but not also lagging behind, which is what the report outlines. The salary schedule options that were presented in the report, they considered a step model, a range model, performance-based compensation. They didn't highlight some of the issues that we have noted here when you read the report. And really, are we prepared for it, and can we implement it in a fair and equitable manner in the culture of the organization? And then their recommended model, which was to go into the grade system without steps. So they're creating the 17 pay grades, which we'll show you. 17 pay grades, 16% between minimum and market in that grade. The total spread is 40%. About 6 to 10% between each of the pay grades, the 17 grades.
I'm gonna ask a question
Yeah.
there. I noticed when it's just kind of looking through
Yeah.
it, that like 6% at the low end, by and large, and then larger spreads at the upper end. So just like a theory of explanation there for why that's that way.
It's a great question. That it came from there. We'll take a peek and see if we can't answer that question. For
Yeah, I
you.
mean, just like the jumps from D through J are all 6%.
Mhm.
And then you have some sort of anomalous mix in the middle. And then as you get to N and up, you're at basically 9.4, 10, 10.
Yeah.
And anomalous 6.1, 9.9, and 30%. So maybe I'm sure there's a rationale for that.
That's a
but
great question.
just wondered.
I'm going to guess, without being the consultants who wrote the recommendations, it relates to market. As we get to the higher grades, you're going to start to see more and more specialized jobs and then meeting the market. So I'm going to guess that when you see the jobs, which I'll show you by grade, you will start to see some of that consolidation that way, or rationale that way, I should say. So the recommended salary schedule, I will jump to in a second. I just want to roll through position placement, which we will discuss as well. Reclassification, employee placement are all mentioned in there. And looking through, we do need to, despite whatever we make decisions today, it ultimately falls to the manager to make sure we achieve equity within the grade, and then also, avoid compression with long tenured staff versus newer staff. Job titles are also slated for revision, which is something we can undertake. And then FLSA exemption, we will obviously go through, and ultimately at some point, should the charter ever be opened up, we will need to talk about classified versus unclassified staff. Because obviously the charter of 1954 designates who is unclassified, but the management pool has grown greatly since that time in local government. And so,
A lot of things have changed since 1950.
we also talk about maintenance of the salary schedule. So this is something that, in my opinion, the city has not done a great job at. We certainly have done a very hyper local market comparison year over year, but not again updated. And that's really how we ended up with all these ranges and not holding to a tighter grade pattern and really keeping like jobs in the same spot, in the same grade, I should say. So those recommendations are well taken. Salary schedule adjustments, which we do want to talk about in the resolution that you'll see. Again, historically, the city has been built around an expected pattern of increases. July 2% COLA, a pay for performance increase averaging 1.5 in January. Couple factors there. One, this report recommends that we may look at different months in that operation. From a fiscal perspective, I completely agree with that. We are essentially committing to a pay raise right at the front end of the fiscal year, not knowing how revenue will look. So if you look back to the 2020 fiscal year, COVID hits March of 2020, but all the decisions about increases were made in April of 2019 for that fiscal year, right? So as the market dips, you really are locked in on your compensation level for that year. And so we'd like to take out the date specific times for compensation increases. Because one, the council must make an appropriation available. If there's no money for it, we cannot offer the change in the salary. And two, to allow, if there is fluctuation in revenue, and we do have some volatility to deal with, that we can then come to council and make those changes. Look really at probably a January and May schedule, which allows us to get into the fiscal year, make those, allow an increase in January and again in May. So it's all within the fiscal year. If we're going to do two, we're going to do one, wherever it may fall.
And this is really the core of the question that we're asked to weigh in on today with regard to the policy change.
In
correct?
regards to policy 2.02,
Right.
which requires section 2 of the personnel manual requires your approval to amendments.
So is this an appropriate time for me to just ask a question about
Yep.
that? So I understand all that. I understand the desire to have, be able to just have some view of what the economy looks like when you're making those decisions. But also it's sort of the proposal, as you know, suggests that for lots of reasons, it makes sense to have sort of two or at least different dates on which this is happening. The policy really takes you from two specific ones to no guidance whatsoever around doing that multiple times. And it puts it entirely in the discretion of the city manager. And, I'm sure, well, we trust your judgment to make that view. It's sort of, it runs a little bit counter to what I read the proposal as saying. So I'm just curious what your view is on that question and whether there's some way to indicate in the policy that the manager is going to exercise discretion over when those dates may be, but also that you're taking seriously the recommendation of the consultant in terms of the value of doing it multiple times for purposes of employee understanding and what have you.
Yeah, so the wording is up to be massaged. That's certainly not problematic. I actually thought the recommendations of the consultants were a little more aggressive than what the city could fiscally handle. First recommendations, I don't know if it's in this report or in the broader report, was that the COLA would match CPI each year. That, I can't recommend that or put that in the policy. So our attempt was to kind of soften that as well as getting away from the strict timeframes.
Understood.
I think the other, many of the cities that McGrath works with, and we talked to them, are not charter cities like we are, where executive functional power is vested in the manager, right? So councils and boards are making those updates to compensation policy as they're elected. Of course, in the city of Webster Groves, we have a different model with the charter. So that executive functions do fall to the manager to determine when those are. Our real issue with the policy is ultimately as it's written now. It really speaks to, and I'll pull it up here briefly. It speaks to right now, temporarily suspended due to budget constraints. And regardless, even if we put specific dates in, budget constraints don't happen year over year. But if the city was going to say, we don't want to do two increases, we want to do one per year, again, the policy really speaks to just that one locked in model, which we've run for some time.
And one other thing I want to throw into this conversation, we do have a collective bargaining agreement with fire. We are anticipating a collective bargaining agreement with police. I guarantee you, if we say that we are going to give you a pay increase no matter what, if council were to say in a given year, we can't do it as they did this year. So again, the pay for performance was eliminated because council said we can't afford it. Okay. So, but fire has still grieved that issue and said, wait a minute, in our policy, it says this is here. So we have to be careful, recognizing that those words are read differently by different people who may determine that there's a vested interest in whatever that policy language is, even though it's only policy. It ultimately has to be approved by council. So there's a bit of a balance, and I get what you're saying, but again, we have to make sure that the expectation is we want to do these things, we will do these things if we can do these things, and council says we can do these things. So there's the balance on the language, if that makes sense, Jeff.
I understand.
Yeah, okay.
Just so everybody knows, we will be entering collective bargaining with our police as well. That is underway. They just timing is not all there, but it will be there. And so therefore, much like fire, whatever is recommended for this year in budget, we will be excluding those two departments.
And again, just an asterisk, one of the problems that we've had with fire has been our personnel manual and some of the policies have just not been updated over the years. And so when they created the collective bargaining agreement, they said, we're adopting as part of this agreement our policies. Without updates on the policies, it has been a real nightmare and has generated some arbitration, which we've prevailed in. But again, it's because the prior personnel director or HR director just simply wasn't updating the policies. And so, again, that's a problem that we're dealing with.
And while prevailing is nice, I would really prefer they weren't issues.
Yes, yes.
So another question
Mhm.
about the timing.
Mhm.
I guess it seems like this change would allow like a lot of discretion, which is fine, I understand that, but what would so the current schedule is January and July, like practically speaking, what would you be looking at doing in the future? And also, would that be communicated to employees? So
Mhm.
even if it's not part of the policy, they kind of have a working understanding of what to expect.
So the recommendations of the compensation classification study are January and May. We have looked at that. One of the things we would like to do is move off of the hard date of January 1 to the first day of a pay period following that, right? Just to ease calculations and avoid tax year crossovers on some of these issues. And then in May in the same way. And again, that keeps, if we're going to do two all in the same fiscal year, which is July to the end of June. So the budget can allow for that, and we can also have the flexibility of as revenue estimates and expense estimates change. And then we always publish a payroll calendar to all employees that indicates when payroll is, any changes in benefit status, when they will be affected. So we would certainly communicate to employees when we anticipate, should the budget, obviously, we talk about discretion, but ultimately if the budget says that we have to pay people a 3% COLA, let's just use that. We have a ministerial duty as the executive branch to then do what the budget authorizes, right? And so, so if the funding is there, we have to put that into place. But it's really having the ability to have the conversation with council, especially in tough budget years, which we're about, probably gonna be about $2 million deficit this year, about, if we approach an increase, do we have the funds available to make this a sustainable base increase?
And those two timeframes that Eric just mentioned, these were presented to council as part of the comp and class, and then the consultant did that, and then I did my follow-up, tweaking that based on what would work for not only our payroll system, but for budget. So I know that's not part of here, but they will not be surprised by hearing these recommendations.
No, I was just going to say, I'm concurring with what Eric said. We don't have the authority to not do it. It's just a question of when we do it. So, and I think that, again, goes to what you're saying, Frank, too, about making sure we're communicating this information. That's something we'd have to do as well. But that has not historically been what we have done. But I think that's part of the plan, is to make sure people understand it. Move it from the realm of an absolute expectation or an entitlement, for lack of a better word, to the realm of, again, council has approved it. This is what it's going to be. Here's the time.
We could just work on some improved language for that sentence.
Want me to keep walking through the study results?
Sure,
Okay. So obviously, as we go through the recommendations here, moving down through that, it'll talk about the equity analysis that HR would be undertaking as we look at these, and then also following summaries. So this is wage by gender per pay grade. I believe female is in red. Those identify as female. Blue is the average wage. Males are in this grayish color there. So we do have some areas, as you can see here, like in R, female lagging, but then of course in some areas females exceeding males. So a mixed result there. Race by pay rates by race per grade. These are the new grades, by the way, excuse me, not the that we'll be talking about, the 17 ranges or grades. Again, Caucasian in the light yellow, and green is all other races, blue is the average. Benefit analysis, I won't go in through all this, but obviously we do have some benefit analysis to do as well. They point out the health plan summary. Our family plan is a well-subsidized plan by employees, whereas employees pay $0 for the single plan option. So if you're on the family plan, you're really kicking it a lot compared to those who have single coverage. So some equity issues there. Premiums, again, we just talked about that. I think if you've paid any attention to the City of Webster Grove's human resources issues, we did make some changes to paid time benefits. We did change already with the council's concurrence, the accruals for vacation and over sick time, per this report, and also put a cap on the payouts, sick time. For those who are, we essentially said for those that are 50 this year and have at least 10 years of service, the policy that we have in place of payouts of sick time remains in effect. For those not reaching that threshold, it is no longer in effect.
So they aren't paid out for sick, unused.
Correct. So we are one of the few remaining local governments that still has a sick time payout. And right now, the current policy before this change was if you were over 50 and had 10 years of service, you got paid out for a quarter of your sick leave that you've accrued. Maximum accrual was 1,200 hours for regular employees, 1,800 for firefighters. And if you were over 50 and had 20 years of service, you had a 50% payout. So those again that are at 50 plus years of age in this calendar year and at 10 years of service will be paid out at those thresholds. Those that are under, like myself, we are not eligible for the sick time payout. We don't, no one lost any hours in the changes of accruals or such, but it was obviously a change. And again, our compensation model had been a lower pay on the front end in salary and a much higher retention benefit or a payout benefit as you move through your service.
There was one of the things that I really took as a takeaway from the consultants in all of our meetings was that our previous model that Eric just described as changing, it really worked better for our seasoned employees that have been here. And so of course they didn't lose with this model change, but as we're trying to recruit employees in a new age, they're not necessarily, you guys know this as HR professionals, as focused on their payouts, their retirement. They are really wanting to see those wages upfront in their checks. And so that was something that really, as we're trying to turn and pivot and be able to recruit better. Is that a fair word?
There's a fair word.
Recruit it all.
Be competitive.
Be competitive.
Yeah.
Is something that's really important.
With regard to the immediate financial impact of changing systems, there's, as you implement the new one, there's going to be certain people who require adjustment immediately to the new minimum. Is that right? And so is that based out of already appropriated funds, or is that comes from the subsequent year as a part of, like, how does that work?
So you're talking about on the grades to the new minimums?
Yeah, so somebody's currently, you put in the new grades and someone is below the current minimum, they get moved up, right? Like as a separate matter from their.
So we have not done that, have not made that move yet. That's
Got
part of this meeting and then going to council ultimately. The salary allotments per program unit in the budget are built on the former ranges and where people are at, in their salary pay. So if someone's at $15 an hour, the budget is built for them at $15 an hour and they're flowing fringe from that. So the point of this conversation, the personnel board must act as the city council must. If the city council were to act, then is to appropriate additional funds to make that delta jump, right? To bring everyone to the new base.
So be all in the forward-looking
Exactly,
budget year.
correct, yeah. So, and hence why we're in the optimum time for this with a bunch of conversations coming up.
So just as an example, the sick time, that change in no longer paying out time, based on what you just explained, is that money that is now, was that included in the budget and then?
No, really, unfortunately, this history of the city, if we knew somebody was going to retire, we would include our estimates, and obviously everyone still gets their vacation time paid out. We all know that's a property right issue, and also comp time if they have it. But in general, someone we didn't know was leaving, that was unbudgeted.
Okay.
And so those were an unfunded liability, truly in their clearest sense, because we just had to find money and we would constantly be transferring to accomplish that payout. This budget we are coming into, we have now for the first time created a separate centralized spend in human resources for separation payouts so that we have accounted for all those we estimate. And then we use our auditors have given us the 0.8 number, 0.8 of 1% for compensated absences is what they expect. And so we have included that funding. So that does cause a stressor to the budget because we've never had those budgeted, and that makes it that much harder to balance, but it is a truer budget in terms of costs we know we have to pay.
So you're asking if we found money by making that change, we did not,
Yeah.
because it was
Yeah.
not there.
Okay.
I mean, nine people this year are expected to be about $200,000 worth of payout. So some of these payouts run $50,000 to $60,000. So hence, and that's really about the accrual amount, right? I mean, we had very high accruals, which the report recommended coming back into a much more market comparable range. Sick time we just discussed as well, and that is in the report. Retirement, there has been no change and no change intended here in this conversation with the loggers retirement systems. And then again, final recommendations, classified and unclassified. Certainly, we do need to have some conversations, and that's embedded in the charter. So we will bring that up at the appropriate time. So this is the recommended salary schedule, which I will zoom in a little bit so you can all see it a little better here. So we have 17 grades D through Z. And so the police records technician in police is placed in D. This is all done by the consultants. So this is not us at the city. This is the consultant's recommendation. You can see the minimum, the market, the maximum hourly, and then their yearly salary amounts. E and the F is when you start to get into the bulk of many of these, again, like titled, like operational duties placed in the same world. I just want to point out maintenance worker one, which both in Parks and Rec and Public Works here, this is really some of that labor conversation we're talking about, 1995 range. Right now, we're hiring at 1710. You know, so we are well behind the market in that regard. And so getting to minimums is going to be a good thing there.
So are we, or is someone also looking at the different job titles for similar work and, you know, like maintenance worker one, parks, maintenance worker one, rec?
Yeah, so they're the same exact job title. The difference is here is what you see as our program budgets. We have a park improvement fund, which can go towards parks, but we don't consider things like things in the ice arena part of the park funding. So they're separate budget units
Okay.
where they're paid out of. That's the difference really
Okay,
between. If we had a combined budget in that regard and not a dedicated fund, we would just say maintenance worker one, parks and recreation.
okay,
The positions and the job descriptions are pretty identical. It's
okay,
just where they're paid from.
okay. And is it similar with the other, like administrative coordinator?
Administrative coordinators, they're all related to their what department they're working for. So.
Okay,
And there are literally, I think, 6 administrative coordinators, 5 or 6 across the city, all within the
Okay.
department. So there are some changes, like if you look here, the fiscal technician, this was our accounts payable purchasing person, and this was the title that the consultant recommended after looking at the market and really the job duties as well. That, you know, within the accounting world, calling someone an AP purchasing clerk is no longer the world that we work in. And so fiscal technician really better gives them the title and the potential for career laddering and identification to other market holders.
And on that same note, there were some recommendations that after having conversations with the consultants, we didn't accept. For one, administrative coordinator. This may sound like small potatoes, but it was recommended that be an administrative assistant. Our administrative coordinators would,
yeah,
they'd have fit.
yeah.
So there were things like that we chose not to go to battle on.
Makes sense.
So again, as we noted before, as we move up, you start to see more of the direct supervision and accounting of people here. You have maintenance supervisors who are overseeing folks as you get into J and such as you move up. Just scrolling through, highlighting some. Building inspector, public works inspector, certainly a high demand job for us as well. IT really made a big jump here. We were well underpaid in IT, so and needs for cybersecurity coming up there. You start to see those superintendents, which are the second level, the middle management of parks and recreation and public works areas, really highlighting here in the M. N is where you get you start to see that wider gap. Now you're getting into much more specialized and oversight type jobs and really higher level executive thinking. Our finance manager, HR manager role, IT manager. This is our police lieutenant, which sits right below the captains, assistant director of public works. The battalion chief here, these red numbers here are meant to show out some compression issues, right, as we look. Obviously not in here as you don't see firefighter, paramedics, and fire captains. They'll be collectively bargained with. So that was redacted out of the public report. And if you want to discuss that, we need to go to close, but there is a compression issue we need to look at with battalion chiefs as currently, just in the current pay, captains are getting real tight and close to them.
And we would need to go to close because we are currently negotiating with them. And of course, it would be protected under sunshine as a closed record because we're still in negotiations.
Here we now get into R was where we see the some of the directors coming in here as well. And really, our assistant fire chief, you really see the fire service really pushing up. You see a lot of our directors, but here's a number 2 of a department. So our fire service demands of the market are exceeding some of our normal structures in other places. Our directors, again, are police captains, which are the number 2. There's 2 of them in the police department in that role. And then here is your top level S bracket, and then Z is the city managers, which is currently not even a graded position, a range position. It's set by the council directly. And that again is in the report we have for you and lines up with the numbers we have put in Exhibit A. And then there are definitions, obviously, which I will not take your time to walk through. So that is the review of the system. I'm happy to talk through what we're proposing, which is, again, under the policy manual and under the charter, your approval through the resolution of these ranges that they be recommended to the council for approval under the city's pay plan. And then B, however the board may wish, we do look for your your approval of amendments to 2.02 B, or excuse me, D2, the pay increases in that language, which is codified and all that in that resolution, which you have in front of you, PB 2022-1. So,
Are there any current employees who are making more than the maximums?
there are none that will exceed the new maximums. There are none that exceed the current maximums either.
Okay.
So, just again, now the only time that ever could have come up is there are people who are at the maximum, usually long-term and tenured employees, that in the past system would get the 2% COLA, which means their range moves, they'd still be at the maximum. But then that 1.5% performance pay, again, would come in. We are not allowed under the Missouri Constitution to give bonuses, but people would get an extra check if they were at the maximum to account for what should have been their base increase. And that again is a real problematic area of our performance model that we had is, we are not allowed to give bonuses, but yet we call them bonuses. And so rightfully so, we have part of ending that practice was we're not going to irk the ire of the state on this one. So Neil, if there's anything you want to add?
No,
to that?
you're spot on. Once we realized it was like that unfortunate word was used, it was like, what?
And did I hear you correctly? There's no one today whose current salary is beyond the newly proposed maximum for that
No.
grade.
No.
Okay.
But with the 1.5% performance, they might.
Correct. So if someone is at the maximum when we move the range, right, and is there, and if we add a second increase without changing the ordinance, that would exceed the maximum. And in the past, they've done that with a lump sum check, which was not considered a base increase. And
But
the
you're
city,
not allowed to do.
but we're not allowed to do that. So we really walked, I would not authorize.
We
those
do not
payments.
want to do.
Yeah, so then it will just be once an employee reaches this max.
Right.
That would be it.
Yeah.
And there are, in my review, and I would show this to you all, but it has folks' information in it. There are none that would go in the new grade system that would be at the maximum within the next 10 years. So
Okay.
the theory obviously being as the ranges move, they're going to move. And should they get an extra performance increase or such that, the goal is obviously to take the next step in your career, right? If you're reaching the max. Well, we don't want to lose anyone. We also encourage folks to make the right move. So just a review, there are, you asked about this, there are 20, there are plans for the budget that Dr. Peoples will be proposing. Dr. Peoples, you mind if I?
Go for it.
Okay, is to move 29 people, current staff, into new minimums. So some of them would receive 17, 18% increases with this, pay increase, getting into their new minimums, obviously lower end of the pay grades. There are then 3 more that would need to get into a new minimum, but the percentage of their increase would be less than the 2% COLA that we are recommending to the city in the budget. So take fire and police out of this because they're in the collective bargaining. All other employees, 29 would make a jump up to get into new minimums. Then 44 more would get a 2% COLA under the recommendation we're making to the council. You don't have to opine on the COLA amount and such like that, just giving you the background and semblance of it. And then obviously the results of collective bargaining would go back to council for approval and authorization as well. You asked about numbers, roughly about $140,000 to bring everyone up to that minimum. And then looking probably close to about another $160,000 to bring everyone up to the 2% mark.
And if you have thoughts on COLA, I would certainly be interested in hearing it.
We have done some just quick outreach to others. I mean, there's a couple cities, there's a city giving an 8% COLA increase this year. You know,
And I would guess that they're trying to align with CPI, which is a little bit over 8%.
Yeah.
And it's needed. I wish I could offer 8% or make that as a recommendation to the council, but from your own respective industries and just your knowledge, expertise, I would really like to hear what you think about a COLA. In many ways, my recommendation of the 2% is just a drop in the bucket, especially we know that healthcare insurance is increasing by 7%. So it's not even a wash with what employees without single coverage would be paying. Where would you all like to go?
Okay, so on the resolution.
yes,
It looks like there are three
yes.
changes or.
Would you like me to walk through those?
Sure.
Okay, so the first one obviously is the biggest reason we're here today is that under a change in the pay plan, you, under the charter, must, take the manager's pay plan, make a recommendation to the council, which makes the final approval. So that's resolve number one, that you recommend the adoption to create the 17 pay grades for the compensation classification study. When we look at the personnel policies in 2.1 on job classification, as we already have a classification system, it is the job under the amendment section of that, the reclassification of the manager to then put a final decision. If anyone wants to read it, you certainly can, for classification. So the second resolved is about the city manager's job is to then take the compensation classification and make sure we move these titles into their recommended ranges,
So it's kind of like that.
dropping them into grades, right?
Okay.
So moving from how many to the 17?
The 43 to the
43,
17.
okay.
Yeah. And in reality, we have the recommendations. There are some areas where we'll have to go through, does this because of compression line up, right? If if we have a 20-year, 10-year employee in this grade, is this the right spot? So I mean, there may be a few minor tweaks here and there, but essentially the compensation and classification recommendation is just pull it in, everyone's in those grades.
So how will those decisions be made?
So that is in the classification policy, which we have now, Neil, and I'm looking at 2.1. And so ultimately you can read it if you wish, but
Okay.
we didn't send it out to you, so
Oh,
it's
okay.
right here, but it's an employee, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was gonna say it's also.
So ultimately, the director, makes an investigation, of the position, determines correct classification, report those findings in writing. The city manager should make a final binding decision in writing. So the city manager puts those folks in their new classification. So existing positions get reclassified into their appropriate grade, and that's reported out to all the employees.
So that would just be changes to the,
Exactly. That would be if the fiscal technician now, is under this system supposed to go in the F.
okay,
Management agrees with that, it goes in the F, right?
Okay.
So
not for individuals.
not for
Okay.
individuals, no.
And again, the recommendation around the creation of the 17 pay grades, that authority exists fully within the city manager, and that's a council.
Again, it's a recommendation
It's
and
a-
ultimately council.
Okay, the council makes that one.
Yes.
Based on their own.
But we start with you all. You
It's
all have to make
recommendation.
that recommendation.
Got it.
Yes.
But these other items are fully at the discretion and authority of the city manager. If and when
The classification is,
right,
the third resolved about the pay
that has
increases,
to be,
that any amendment to this chapter 2, section 2 of the personnel manual is the merit system rules requires your approval as the personnel board.
Right.
So we are recommending that approval, recommending to you to approve a change in those timing requirements.
but we're not the final authority on that. There's some.
No,
there's
you
some-
are.
We
You
are.
are on that.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Forgive me.
So
Yeah.
again, ultimately, if you look at our
But you
system,
don't get a special parking place or anything.
Yeah.
Uh,
ultimately, the charter merit system is much like a civil service system. So in a way, you're acting like a civil service commission, and you are the final determination on amendments to chapter 2. The rest of this manual, other than if it violates city policy, all does fall at at the execution of the city manager. Does that answer your questions about the three different resolves, Madam Chair?
Yes.
So should we just go like point by point or?
Probably best, yeah, because ultimately, we're gonna need a vote on some things, and so we're gonna have to record a vote that will actually be included in some minutes somewhere along the way, so yeah, that would be the best way, yes.
So how do we?
So the way you would do this, you'd start with the review perhaps of the comp and classification study. Someone would vote to recommend the comp and class study that was done, to recommend the recommendations be adopted. And if that is done and that's seconded, then it would be voted.
I thought some of what the city managers and the city's desire here are somewhat different from the recommendations of the.
Yes,
study.
I'm talking about the recommendations that you've seen here.
Oh, okay.
The
got it.
17
Got it.
Yes,
Got it.
yes.
Okay.
There are pieces within the whole study that are out of the realm of your review, so that are simply a determination for the manager and the council to take up and such like that, much like benefits and things.
So perhaps the way to make that clear in the motion would be to say there'd be a motion to adopt Exhibit A, which includes the compensation and classification study and recommended pay grades. And so now you have an exhibit that actually has what it is that you're adopting, okay?
You just want to discuss. Before we,
Do you want
Yeah.
to pull the pay grades back up and so you can see who's in them? We're happy to answer any questions. We know it's a lot of material.
I'll scroll up here.
And Chandler is a terrific resource. If you have specific questions about any of the pay grades or positions, the work that's goes into those.
so when you do through the job description review, are you planning on having kind of the same number of positions as reflected here? Are you, might you change their titles a little
All
bit?
so all the job description review that's happening. So let's just take the court clerk, right? There's two people in the court clerk's job in that position. So that job description is being worked on, looking at the market comparables and their actual work that's happening, right? To really give us a job description that reflects the actual work. We have a lot of job descriptions that still reference things that we haven't done for some time, right? Because they haven't been updated. And I don't want to speak for Chandler, but in relation, the job description review isn't affecting this. Because those jobs have been really gone. There was a questionnaire that really went through the incumbents, laid out what they do. And that was what was used to compare to the market because our job descriptions were so out of date.
Okay, so the job descriptions are really just being updated to reflect like reality.
The reality, yes.
Reality and all the employees, so maybe we should have started there, my apologies. All the employees have been part of this process. They filled out their own position description questionnaires. Their supervisors then went over those with them, and then they went through HR, through Chandler and Christina, who I don't believe you all met. And then they worked with the consultant to refine them. The consultant then came on site and met with directors and had those conversations and asked any questions about those position questionnaires. So what they're doing now is packaging that and developing it into an updated job description. It has not happened in a vacuum without the employees.
Okay,
And then once we get those, and we're currently in the process of getting those back, we're gonna have the departments heads to look them over to make sure they do reflect our current market reality, as you said. And then if any changes need to be made, we'll make those changes with the consultants.
So there could be inconsistencies between like maintenance worker on the park side, maintenance worker on the rec side, and because maybe they've historically done different things, or
It would be small inconsistencies, but there could be. The Parks and Recreation is one department, so they're really going to be very much aligned.
yeah,
Where
okay,
you're going to see a difference is a maintenance worker one in Public Works versus Parks and Recreation. These are folks that are out there helping to pave the street.
Yeah.
running a snow plow and such.
And those should be very small tweaks by this stage, by all the iterative back and forth processes. Any large items really should have already come to surface.
So it's kind of like what the incumbent's doing and what the market says that role should be doing, putting those together, and it becomes that.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I would lean towards recommending these. What do you guys want to discuss before we take a vote?
I've had my questions answered
Yeah.
to my satisfaction, feeling.
Okay, so could we just vote on the first one before we move on?
Sure, move to adopt exhibit A.
Okay, I will move to
Yeah.
adopt exhibit A.
I'll second.
Yeah.
So
And we need a roll call vote. So
by name,
by name.
okay. Is somebody taking vote?
I'm recording.
Okay,
right now.
all right, let's see. Kimmy Sauer, how do you vote?
I vote to recommend exhibit A.
Okay,
Jeff.
Jeff.
Mazer, sorry.
Yeah, yes. How do you vote?
I vote aye.
And so do I, Francis Barbieri, I vote to recommend the new pay grade schedule.
Three, nothing.
Now, number two then would be, actually, I would tell you that we need to probably amend 2.02 as the next step. Because ultimately that's built into the resolution, since we've got both things in the resolution. So if the language in 2.02 subsection D2 is acceptable, then move to approve 2.02 as amended.
So just so
And
I
if not, we
understand.
can.
We can tweak the language.
Yeah, so it's the underlying red, the pay increases shall be provided at a time. That's new wording.
That's the language we have provided.
And
And
then-
then the struck words are
Okay.
are the existing policy.
Okay,
And I have it in live real time, so we can edit as we go, if you wish.
I'll make a motion for amendment of policy 2.02, section D2,
So do we have,
As submitted or?
as amended. Yeah.
do we have the ability to like talk about editing the new language?
Yes.
Okay, so
I'll withdraw my motion for time being.
Okay.
Mr. Secretary.
my recommendation would be to provide, if we can, a little bit of detail about, so the pay increases shall be provided at a time determined by the city manager based on some sort of, you know, whatever the factors might be. You know, projected revenue for the year or probably what
Right.
the lawyer and you would like to suggest is that it would be pay increases shall be provided at a time determined by the city manager, which may be based on factors such as, you know, to always allow for the unforeseen factors.
What if we struck some of that middle language? Pay increases shall be provided in alignment with available appropriated funds for pay increases. Rather than as determined. Because council's gonna have to appropriate the funds.
And the timing is based on when the
Correct.
funds are appropriated, so
Correct.
everything is.
So tell me what the language would read.
So we read in pay increases shall be provided in alignment with the available appropriated funds. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that takes out some of the confusing language as determined by.
but then what factors are looked at to determine?
Appropriated funds.
Yeah.
So,
Well, so
well,
those are
ultimately,
gonna
the
be,
council can't be bound by any factors, right, Neil?
right, and where the real confusion in this was, is that we had this provision that says, while the city will make every effort to conform to this plan, it may be temporarily suspended due to budgetary constraints, right? That's not how anybody wanted to read that. So again, if we went back to this language, it probably does that. But maybe if you just added something at the end, in alignment with available appropriated funds for pay increases as determined by council. Now you've left it fully within the discretion of the council, right? And so council has made a decision, and that these decisions get made at the time that budgets are created. So again, what we're doing there is retaining the discretion in council's hands, and I think that there's wisdom in that.
I mean, I'm sorry, just to explore this further. I mean, the council is providing an aggregate sum of money that is intended to cover the cost of these things. What's actually happening is the city manager and her assignees are making individual determinations about how to allocate those appropriated funds across different employees, no?
No, so every budget is built, so literally the finance department budget is built on the four of us in finance, our pay. And then there's a recommended proposal from the manager, which we talked about, right? So everyone's gonna shift up 2%. And then if we have recommended another increase, that's added in. So the
And it's
council,
not dependent at all on.
absolutely, it's
Individual
dependent.
performance.
It is, that second increase has historically been. So last year, we built a budget, the original budget was built with a 2% COLA and the 1.5% performance pay. When the council said, the manager said, I'm gonna recommend we take both of those out due to budget problems. And they said, we'll take the 1.5% out. We literally went in on every person's individual line item and pulled out that 1.5% calculation and the flowing fringe that would apply to that. So that series of calculations goes across every employee with every budget move we make. Because we don't have enough funds to just build a general worker pool, right?
So does that close the door? I mean, barring
but I
further
think what you're
policy
saying,
change on it?
I disagree with what Eric's
I
conclusion.
heard the question a little differently too.
Yeah, so what I think you were saying is, we do a budget. And within that budget, it's up to the city manager when it comes to this particular category to decide how allocation might occur on something other than a COLA increase, because a COLA increase is a COLA increase, right? So again, I agree with that. This would give the city manager within her purview the decision to decide if there was going to be performance pay in a given year, how it would be allocated. And that's sort of been what we've been doing up until this point, although it's not been well stated. So that would still exist as I see it. Do you agree?
Right, but if we strip out the language about the to be determined by city manager.
By the
that's
city council.
To be at risk, right?
Right,
That would be a risk.
right. So yes, you would take that out. And now what you're doing is relying on the discretion of council to set what that number is. But within that framework, the city manager then makes her decisions on the performance pay or whatever we're calling merit or performance pay. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense, and I'm curious what you think the language on, is your surmise that the language as initially crafted?
No.
No,
I
we can take that out.
I like this change. Pay increases shall be provided at a time, in alignment with available appropriated funds for pay increases as determined by city council. So after pay increases, we add the words as determined by city council, right there, yes.
Oh, okay, and leave the language about.
Yeah, you can
as
leave,
determined by the city manager.
yeah, you can leave that in because ultimately, my
Okay.
opinion is that the city manager doesn't have the ability in the absence of council direction to simply say, I'm going to wipe out that pay increase.
Yeah, I think my concern was generated by the deletion of the city manager language
I'm
in
taking
the
this
prior
out.
iteration.
So do you think it should be out or in?
No. I think it should be in,
Okay.
but my colleagues,
No,
I
I
think maybe suggested differently.
think that makes sense.
If there's a time when performance pay is reinstituted, I like it being in. Candidly, as I've already said, we're not at a place organizationally where I think that can equitably be done.
I don't want to say my amendments need to stay here. Fran made suggestions about what she wanted to see included or excluded, which I want to honor.
My general recommendation was that we need to provide more detail about how the city manager is going to determine what time is right. But I think that by adding the determined by city council part, that takes care of that.
Okay.
We could, Fran, if you wanted, after that, say the timing of such increases shall include consideration of, and then we could start to talk about whatever those variables might be that might affect the timing one way or another.
I mean, my big concern is the way that employees would read this.
Mhm.
And I'm not an expert on like the city budget process at all. I don't-
Mhm.
But I do know about
Mhm.
how employees perceive policy changes,
Mhm.
and especially when it comes to their pay, and they're being very sensitive to,
Mhm.
you know, so that's my kind of overarching
Sure.
concern.
Because it takes out the specific month, so then it's like maybe she's not gonna have them at all because it doesn't say the specific dates.
Yeah,
Which,
Well, here's one other thing we could do, just switching the structure of the sentence. And it should say, pay increases shall be provided in alignment with available appropriated funds for pay pay increases as determined by city council and at a time to be determined by the city manager. So you've established that the city council is going to establish what it's going to be. All the city manager is doing is making a determination as to timing.
I mean, what I hear, and I think it's a great point, is that this goes from something that's certain and in time, right? I know what I'm gonna be entitled at this point in time to. This is gonna happen maybe at the discretion of some person who, you know, I vaguely know.
which, not to belabor that point, as a public employee, is always, right? I mean, we don't have certainty, especially because we're revenue constrained, right? I mean, our revenue grows at 1% over a year.
I think, I think I agree with, I understand what Fran is saying. I also think that, like, I'm gonna concern myself with whether this makes sense in terms of the policy. I think you all have to be stewards of your own communication challenges or realities about how this is gonna roll with employees as they receive it. I think, particularly to the degree that it goes in more or less simultaneously with recommendations about pay grades, which are gonna lead to people getting somewhere between 2 or 3% and 17 or 18%. That is a positive thing if those two things are linked. But again, that's outside of mine.
I like that change that to move at a time determined by the city manager to the end, because I think it's a little bit more clear.
So pay increases shall be provided in alignment with available appropriated funds for pay increases as determined by the city council and at a time. Yeah, I like that too.
The motion in order to adopt this, right?
Are you ready to go? Yeah. Okay.
All right. I would make a motion for adoption of the policy 2.02, section D2 as amended here in this meeting on the screen.
Kim, you were saying?
Yep.
You want me to read the rule? Or would you like to do it again? Or do you want more discussion?
Do they still have to vote even though they moved?
Yes.
Okay. Jeff Nazar, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Kim Sauer, how do you vote?
Yes.
And I, Francis Barbieri, also vote yes.
And then finally, we have the proposed resolution, which is PB 2022-01, which would reflect the two changes you've just made. So again, this is a recommendation that you are sending to council to adopt your recommendations on these matters.
I just want to clarify one thing for Neil, the policy change that we just talked about there will happen.
Right.
With our council, it's really sending on the 17 pay grades to the city council, so. But as we've amended exhibit B, then you are good to pass this resolution. It does encompass your intent.
On the resolution, should that last sentence, should it say 2.02?
Should.
It should, yeah. So actually, yeah, if you allow, we'll just make a Scrivener change because policy 2.1 up there should be 2.02 as well. We have a variety of numbers across the personnel manual, so.
Okay,
So those are easy Scrivener corrections we can make without needing you to take a vote on those amendments.
That's right.
So,
okay. And so do we have to vote
You just
to
need to-
adopt this resolution?
Yes,
that's correct. Yes, ma'am. So we need a motion and a second to adopt the resolution.
Okay, I'll move to adopt the resolution.
Second.
Roll call vote.
Jeff Nazar, do you vote to adopt this resolution?
Yes, adopt. Yes.
And Kimmy Sauer, do you vote to adopt the resolution? Yes. And so do I, Francis Barbieri.
All right.
That, ladies and gentlemen, would conclude your business.
You can move to adjourn. You don't need a roll call for that.
So moved.
There you go.
Well, congratulations, because it seems like this, getting this study done is probably a really big deal.
It was a big deal, and I think we'll move the organization in the right place. And I think it is a great outcome from